And if you can put your name and affiliation in the chat, that helps us with our note taking.
Give everybody a few minutes to log on. We have a pretty packed agenda today, and I want to make sure we have time for discussion. And you'll notice we built in a break for this one, so we are listening to folks and you know, trying to do better. So we do have a break built in. So I want to make sure we get to that and don't have to skip over. The first thing on our agenda is welcome and introductions. So I guess instead of having everybody, please make sure, to say anything now, please make sure to put your name and your affiliation in the chat. And if there's anybody new who wants to introduce themselves, I feel like that would be great. So if you haven't been to one of these before or you haven't been in a little while, please feel free to, we are trying to build a community. So if you want to say hi and introduce yourself, now is the time.
I can introduce myself. Hi, everyone. I'm new to this community. My name is Devin Domeyer. I'm the Coastal Resiliency Specialist with the Maine Coastal Program.
Welcome, Devin. Thank
Welcome.
you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for joining.
Anybody else?
I'm also new here. Sorry, my camera isn't working at the moment, but my name is Jessica. I'm a postdoc at Northeastern with Randall Hughes and also the Nature Conservancy. I'm excited to hear from different folks here about SAV work.
Welcome.
Very cool.
Hi, I'm Alex Biak, also no camera, and I'm a postdoc at VIMS working with Dr. Chris Patrick on seagrass bivalve interactions, and I'm excited to hear about the seagrass landscape in this region.
Welcome, Alex. Very cool.
Hi, I'm Shilpa Rao. I am a PhD student with Jesse, and working with seagrass ecology, and I'm really excited to hear all the things that are going on.
Welcome, Shilpa.
Thank you.
I see a couple of my other students on there, but I'm not going to call them out. It's fine. Anybody else?
I would say anyone else that's new that hasn't done the membership form on the website. That way you're officially part of the group. There's no fee to join. The rewards are plentiful. You get to spend hours talking about seagrass with us, with SAV, and with us. So please visit the website. I'll put the link in the chat for you to join as a member.
Awesome. Very cool. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started unless anybody else wants to say. I think we're good. All right. So the steering committee met last month, and we took the SAV definition that was worked out with this group in January and sort of what our meta is, and I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share my screen. And don't judge my tabs. Sorry. Which one is it? This one. Okay. And we, there you go. Here is the definition that the group came up with. We would like for you to share with your constituents. As far as if you're, stay with people around you, talk about it. I think the main definition here is this part, right? So a submerged aquatic vegetation or SAV bed is an area of benthic substrates, e.g. riverbeds, submerged estuarine environments, and seabeds that is vegetated with rooted, submerged vascular plants of any density, providing critical ecosystem services. So if you remember, we also had sort of an ecological definition, a management definition, and a monitoring definition. And this was sort of the broad one that we wanted to kind of get out there first. And so this is something that we would post on our website and share for folks if you had needed a definition for any of your work going forward. But I think we're not going to necessarily open this at this time. We're not going to open it up for comments, but please, if you do have any comments or feel very strongly about anything in this definition, contact us, and we're happy to continue this discussion. But this is sort of the broad strokes definition that we got from the group at this time. So moving forward, we will post this, and I think Brooke, are we also posting the other definitions to kind of get feedback on those? Or we're just doing this one.
I don't know. We haven't talked about it, which ones to post, but we can go ahead and do all of them, but that might overcomplicate things again.
Yeah. So maybe let's keep this one.
Yeah, we had talked about only posting this general one, but that if there was an interest after circulating this to maybe revisit those original ones to see if we wanted to add more detail.
All right. So I guess, like I said, we'll post this on our webpage. There'll be plenty of time. If you have any other thoughts or concerns about the definition, please let us know and we'll open the discussion back up. It is a living document. So, but this is sort of the consensus at this time. So we'll post this on our webpage. All right. Anything about that before I move to the next part of the agenda? Nope. All right, and then the next thing I did want to point out is that I'm sure many of you are getting lots of emails from SURF about the upcoming SURF conference and getting your abstracts in and all sorts of things. We, along with the Long Island Seagrass Collaborative, put in a proposal for one of those collab sessions. It's a new thing at SURF this year. And so these are going to be more informal group sessions that'll happen throughout the day of the meeting. So it's not like the workshops which are on that Sunday before. These are also free. So these are sort of throughout the meeting. There'll be breaks in the schedule. You don't have to miss any talks or any concurrent sessions, but there'll be time. And so we did get our collab session, I'll shorten it here. We did get our collab session approved. And so the SAV, East Coast SAV Collaborative with the Long Island Collaborative will be hosting this session. And so our goal, right, is just to kind of, again, continue to bring people together to just kind of help facilitate conversations and getting folks to kind of just brainstorm and work together and develop a community. So we will be selecting a few different discussion topics to talk about then. And as we get closer to the collab session, we'll definitely be pinging you guys to see about interest and what things you would like to talk about. But I guess all that to say, please register for SURF, unlike Z and Brooke, and please come to the meeting and come to the collab session. Any questions about that? Oh, awesome. All right. Oh, I did the recap early. Sorry. The one thing I meant to talk about was the first thing was the living documents of SAV regulations in your state. I skipped over that. Sorry. Please make sure you review that. Add anything. This is something that SAV regulations are even more important now than they were before January 20th. So please just make sure that if you have anything or anything changes, please post that, keep that updated. This is something that I think is a really good resource for our members about what is actually, what regulations are there for protecting or monitoring or what is SAV. And so keeping that updated is important. And I think, yeah, I kind of blew through all that. Sorry. Any comments or questions about any of that so far? All right, then I think I'm going to hand it over to Z. And I know Jed would like to get started.
That's true. More time for you, Judd. So we have four different speakers giving us a bit of an idea about their approach when it comes to mitigation, looking at rather regulations, policies, rules was kind of the catch-all. But in the steering committee, we kind of had a discussion about some of the different examples and at the different places that each of the states are at when it comes to approaching SAV mitigation. And so Judd, as representing North Carolina, you're up first. If you want to give a spiel, I think we'll most likely have some time for questions after each of the speakers. So we'll factor that in. Take it away, Judd.
All right, so I'll try to share my screen here. What's going on here? Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. And you can hear me okay? So I'll
Yes.
go ahead and get started.
It's
And
not in presenter mode, Judd. Judd, if you want to hit the presenter mode.
I will. How's that?
We see the presenter view if you're fine with that.
Go to the top, hit display settings,
Oh, yep.
and then swap. There you go.
Swap, presenter view, and slideshow. How's that?
Perfect.
There you go.
Good, we got it. All right. Good morning, everybody, and happy Earth Day. Right? Today, I think is Earth Day, so it's a good time to talk about seagrasses and seagrass mitigation. So, what I plan on doing today is talk a little bit about what seagrass mitigation is and some of the experiences that I've had during my career. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of evolution of some examples of federal and state policies that I've experienced that probably some of you have as well. I'm glad to see that Ann Deaton and Charlie Deaton are both on the call today because both of them have been involved in the project that I'm going to talk about as a case study example in North Carolina, which is the construction of a public boat ramp, public access facility that will have impacts to approximately 0.7 acres of seagrass habitat. And I'm going to show you the example of what the proposed mitigation plan is for that particular public boat ramp. So the origins of mitigation, I'm going to give you a little bit of history here just to make the point that our original idea came about with the actual implementation of the Clean Water Act, which was produced during the Nixon administration in 1972, specifically Section 404. And this is where we first see the term no net loss of wetlands. And I remember there were several years where we were struggling to understand whether or not at that time period and into the early 80s, whether seagrasses were actually considered wetlands, but that got resolved. And as you go through the different presidential administrations, beginning with President Carter in 1977, you'll see that this policy of no net loss of wetlands and the ideas or concepts around mitigation actually changed a bit. They grew in scope. And we began to see kind of the evolution of policies that broadened what we would consider were appropriate or acceptable mitigation policies for wetlands, specifically including seagrasses. And then we eventually came to this term, avoid, minimize, and mitigate. And that term itself has undergone some evolution in the different policies. And what I'm going to use for an example today is one that I'm most familiar with, the one that I worked with during my career is the NOAA policy. This is the most recent one in 2022. It's the mitigation policy for trust resources. And for the most part, all of the federal agencies, the major agencies that deal with mitigation, NOAA, the EPA, and the Army Corps of Engineers, they all have really relatively similar policies with slightly different tweaks, but the principles, the underlying principles are pretty much the same. And I thought NOAA's policy would be a good one to look at because it directly addresses seagrasses explicitly, and that's through the Magnuson-Stevenson Act and an amendment to it that identified seagrasses as one of our essential fish habitats. And the definition that NOAA uses came from the Council of Environmental Quality's National Environmental Policy Act. So this has evolved into what we now, or what the federal agencies now refer to as the mitigation sequence. So avoid, minimize, and mitigate is now avoid, minimize, and compensate. And when projects that involve mitigation are brought forward, the agencies are supposed to follow these steps, beginning with avoid. Can the impact be avoided altogether? Or are there certain actions or parts of an action or modification of an action that can completely avert the impacts? The next level of consideration is, can we minimize the impact by limiting the degree or magnitude of its action and its implementation? And finally, if neither of these steps in the sequence can be met, what can we do to offset or compensate for the impact by replacing or providing equivalent substitute resources or environments? And that's interesting language because that's part of the evolution of mitigation policies, is to broaden the scope. And we start to experience things like offsite mitigation or the preservation of land, of seascape or sea space to substitute for the resource. So the opportunities for the types of things that we can do for compensation has grown enormously over the years, and it's reflected in the current policies of these federal agencies. And it's been my experience over the years in working on various mitigation projects that most of the state agencies that I've worked with on these projects generally comply with the federal policies. There are often, or there are infrequently, certain tweaks to it. They might ask for more specific limiting factors, but otherwise the states and the federal agencies kind of follow generally the same guidelines. So in this NOAA policy, there's 8 guiding principles. Apply the mitigation sequence appropriately. And this next one applies to us, what we can do to apply the best scientific information available. There's this third one is apply a holistic landscape or a seascape approach. And this will stand out, this particular element, in the case study I'm going to talk about in North Carolina. The fourth one is sort of the elephant in the room, the one that we probably are challenged most with seagrass, and that is promote mitigation strategies with a high probability of success. And we all know that transplanting seagrasses is a challenging endeavor, and it has a high failure rate. So we're faced with that issue time and again with mitigation projects. This is, of course, a more recent one. The next one, considering climate change and resilience when evaluating and developing a mitigation measures. This will come into play in the case study example I'm going to give you for North Carolina. And then the next one, implement compensatory mitigation that has proportional impacts to NOAA trust resource and offset those impacts to the full extent. And this is where the issue comes up often is, are we just considering seagrasses, or are we also considering the functions of the seagrass ecosystem as nursery area, as nutrient cycling, as sediment stabilization? The next one, use preservation of intact habitat as compensation appropriately, taking into account the high risk of habitat loss in many coastal and marine landscapes and seascapes. And this policy opens the door to a lot of opportunities to conduct off-site mitigation, and in some cases out-of-kind mitigation, where we're actually protecting something and claiming that it's equivalent to the resource that we're actually impacting. And again, this idea of landscapes and seascapes will come into play in the example I'm going to give you for North Carolina. And then the last one is collaborate with partner agencies and stakeholders. And this is where the rubber meets the road in mitigation projects, and what I'm referring to here as scoping meetings. This is where the applicants and all the partner agencies, both the federal and state agencies, get together and discuss and review the proposed project. And this is where you get the give and take and the tug of war between the different ideas and the different needs of the stakeholders in coming to an agreement on what is really an appropriate mitigation strategy. So how is it implemented? The first thing you have to do is apply for a project that's going to impact seagrass, and then you have to prepare a mitigation plan. That mitigation plan undergoes stakeholder review, and that, again, evolves into a series of scoping meetings or negotiations about the project, whether or not, we've considered the mitigation sequence appropriately. Can we avoid? Can we minimize? And finally, can we compensate for the proposed impact to the seagrasses? So here are some of the categories that I've experienced during my career. Some of the general categories. It'll be interesting to see what others here today have also experienced. One common type of mitigation that happens, it involves public interest, and that often on the coast, it's roads and bridges, transportation, dredging to maintain navigable waterways. We've had a number of bridge projects here in North Carolina that involve the interaction with seagrasses. I've also had opportunity to work on utilities, aqueducts in the Florida Keys in the 1980s, and more recently, power transmission cables from coming ashore from a proposed wind farm. And then public water access, boat ramps and overwater structures. And that's the boat ramp is one the example I'll give today. I've also had the opportunity to work with military installations on national security issues, especially training facilities that are training on and around or in the water that have impacts on seagrasses. And then, of course, there's a number of commercial interests. A mining project in Australia, a number of marinas that propose construction of access channels in shallow water habitat. And I think one that's emerging today for all of us is the potential that we might have to mitigate for mariculture activities that occur in and around seagrass meadows. And then finally, this general category of coastal development and use, which is, of course, something that's grown over the past 2 decades here in North Carolina. So this is the case study I'm going to talk about today. It's a project that's still under review by state and federal agencies. So there's no resolution of this project, but I thought it would be interesting to talk about it. It is a construction of a boat ramp for public water access. It involves a partnership between the county that I live in, County, North Carolina, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, which has been working on sort of public access facilities for North Carolina, and then a non-government organization called the North Carolina Coastal Federation. The property is a 67-acre parcel of land. The proposal is 6 ramps with a boat basin. It also includes a transient floating dock, 159 parking spaces, and direct access to the ICW with about a 500-foot by 50-foot dredged channel that would be allow for boats to transit to the intercoastal waterway from the launching ramp. So a little bit of background. In North Carolina, the General Assembly in 2007 established a coastal recreational fishing license, referred to commonly here as CRUFL. Along with that fishing license, they created the Marine Resource Fund. And the Marine Resource Fund was designed to implement the use of the funds that were obtained through the recreational fishing license. And that involved people, funding projects that include public education and public water access, research on habitat, projects to enhance, protect, or research fisheries habitat, and explicitly projects that conduct fisheries research. Now, when this project started, they built a number of public water accesses around the state, but they only had a limited number of funds and a limited number of sites that they could place these boat ramps. It was quite a successful and project. It didn't, however, really cover the needs of the general public, because it was not really understood how fast our coastal region was growing, and that the need for public water access was also growing exponentially with it. So, give you an idea where this project is. This is a composite map of our seagrass distribution in North Carolina. And the area that I'm going to be talking about here is Bogue Sound. It's down in the south zone. It's it's fed hydrologically by two inlets, one in Beaufort Inlet and also Bogue Inlet to the west. The actual project location is a little bit west of the center of the sound on the mainland shoreline. This shoreline is really, in the past couple of decades, has become a highly developed area, a lot of subdivisions, a lot of single-family residences. Over to the west here, the east here is Morehead City, Beaufort over here. The Newport River and the North River are two other estuaries, and then the White Oak River. So this is the property from an oblique shot from a drone. It's like I said, a 67-acre parcel. It's a partnership project. So down here in the lower left-hand corner, there's about, I think, 30 acres already in permanent easement status. It won't ever be developed. The Coastal Federation is about to begin construction of their new center in the back of the property here. There'll be a series of county nature trails in a park, and then the boat ramp is going to go in right over here in the southeast corner of the property. And as you can see, it's squeezed by development on both sides of it. And then you can see this view from a vertical image. This is the parking area for the boat ramp. The boat ramps are here. And then this is the access channel going out to the intercoastal waterway. And you can see the shoreline is rapidly developing. This is an older aerial photograph. Cannons Gate is now completely developed. So what I'm going to be mostly talking about here is the primary seagrass mitigation site out here on one of the barrier islands, which are actually dredge spoil islands that were created when the intercoastal waterway was first dredged in the late 20s and early 1930s. There are other aspects of this mitigation project that I'm not going to talk about today. There was a living shoreline just opposite the boat ramp facility, and then proposed living shorelines adjacent to the entrance into the boat basin. So just to back up here and talk about the landscape, when I was first asked to join this project by the environmental consultant for Carteret County, they were looking for a mitigation site and the transplanting of about 0.77, 0.8 acres of seagrass that were going to be impacted by dredging the channel. And at first, when they came to me, I wasn't interested in the project. Going out looking for simply a place to plant seagrasses didn't seem very appealing to me initially. And then a couple months later, I was approached by one of the partners in the project, the director of the North Carolina Coastal Federation, Todd Miller, and he asked me if I would consider some other options as possibilities for seagrass mitigation in this project. And what I want you to do is pay attention to the series of spoil islands along the south side of the Intercoastal Waterway. This is the ICW here. There's a tremendous amount of boat traffic and wake wave energy produced by this. The waters get very turbid along the shoreline. The grass beds are patchy and seasonally ephemeral, mainly meadows of Zostera marina that produced by seed every year, mixed in with some Haliduli rhydi, the tropical species we have. So these spoil islands, like I said, were created when they first dredged the Intercoastal Waterway. As you go from west to east, the islands, they have much higher elevation. They have scrub vegetation on them. They have well-developed marshes, some oyster reefs. And as you move to the east, the islands get increasingly lower in elevation. They're reduced in size. And then you can see there's a series of breaches in overwash points in the islands. And then eventually they disappear. And so over decades of alluvial processes and hydrological processes that overwash the islands, they've been actually decreasing in size pretty rapidly and mostly to the east end. So looking at this from a landscape perspective, we went and looked at aerial photography all the way back into the 1930s. And one thing I want to point out to you, as you can see here, behind the islands, you can see the grass beds. These are mixed species meadows. Some of them are very dense and fairly continuous. And as you move east in the islands, when they start to disintegrate, there's less and less seagrass. And this yellow arrow is pointing right at the mitigation site that we're proposing to work with. And again, over here on the right-hand side of the screen, this is the boat ramp up here in the left, the living shoreline, and this is the primary seagrass mitigation site. So we looked at photography over several years. We have some really good photography that goes back to the early 1980s. And we've been able to track the evolution of these islands and what's been happening physically and biologically. And at this site, you can see in May of 1992, this rectangular polygon here delineates our proposed mitigation site. Back in 1992 and photography back into the 1980s, this this island was pretty well established. And then sometime between 2006 and between 1992 and 2006, this spot breached, and we ended up with a channel. And this is our May 2021 aerial photography. And you can see the grass beds behind the islands. The grass at one time inside this polygon, it's now become very sparse, mostly ephemeral eelgrass meadow produced, established by seed every year. So the idea was that if we were able to attenuate the wave energy from the intercoastal waterway and slow the water currents, we could reproduce the conditions that previously occurred here when the island was intact. That this channel that was produced by the breach would eventually accumulate sediments, and then we'd have a habitat that might be conducive to seagrasses to regrow into the area. So what we proposed is a riprap barrier anchored to both channels and connected to a living shoreline here with crick reef. This barrier has a 14-foot base to it, so we have to also account for the impacts of the proposed riprap sill. This will slow the currents, attenuate the waves. We'll eventually believe we'll get sediment accumulated in this channel, and then what we expect to happen is that the seagrasses that are growing on each side of and behind the intact islands will repopulate this area, and then we'll end up with a grass bed that could be similar to what we had back there in the early 1980s before the breach actually occurred. So we wrote a plan for this. The plan is still under review. It's been through state review. We still haven't got back the federal comments yet. And in advance of actually writing the plan, we went out and surveyed the site. So we did a series of surveys, transect shore normal stations every 5 meters out to the edge of the intercoastal waterway down to about 2 meters of water depth. This is the footprint of the dredge channel. So we have samples from right inside the footprint as well as adjacent to the proposed channel. And then we also did similar surveys in the proposed mitigation site as well as the seagrass beds behind the islands adjacent to it. We used the standard Brown-Blanquet survey method with dropping 3 quadrants at each station point. And we also did a very comprehensive bathymetric survey of both of these locations to understand what the water depths were at the sites and how they might change into the future. So just to show you some of the results, the left column here are the metrics that we're using to describe the characteristics of these sites. This is the first column is the boat ramp channel footprint. It's 0.77 acres. The rock sill footprint at the mitigation site would be about 0.24 acres. So our total areas that are impacted by this are about 1.01 acres. Our mitigation polygon I showed in the previous slide, where we expect seagrasses to recolonize, is about 3.34 acres. So this is about a 3-to-1 ratio. It seemed to be acceptable to the state agencies, and like I said, we haven't heard back yet from the federal agencies. But this ratio here is something we could really worth talking about. It does seem to be a ratio that's accepted generally in mitigation projects. And it was really serendipitous that it turned out this way. We didn't go out and pick the site specifically until we examined the aerial photos and thought about what potentially could happen out there. But what you see in the boat ramp channel footprint, the impacted area, is that we saw that about 74.4% of our quadrats actually had Zostra with a Brown-Blanquet average cover of 0.95. There was very, very little haliduli. Most of the haliduli are small patches up against the shoreline, and the cover was fairly low. And our rock sill footprint is generally lower in both the actual percent occurrence and the cover for Zostra. And again, there's still a low cover and occurrence of haliduli. Based on our reference site, what we see here is what we expected from our preliminary observations is that we had a mixed meadow of Zostra marina and Haliduli rhydi, and the actual contribution of Haliduli in the reference meadow is much larger than any of the impact sites. So what we're arguing here, what we're proposing here, is that we will end up with a seagrass meadow that will be more permanent annually and be more resilient interannually, as well as into the future, considering rising water temperatures. This meadow and the boat ramp footprint is primarily a seasonally ephemeral eelgrass meadow that is produced annually by seed and disappears in the summertime and reestablishes each year that way. This meadow will include that type of process with the eelgrass, but will have this more permanent or perennial haliduli component to it. And it will be a mixed meadow, we believe, with potentially a larger degree of persistence and resilience.
Not to
And
interrupt,
just
Judd, but you've got maybe a couple more minutes left so that we can leave some
Right.
time for questions.
Good. So that's our proposal. The current conditions out there now, if we hope to actually achieve the historical reference conditions that we observed with the aerial photography. So in addition to in this mitigation plan, we also have to develop a set of monitoring protocols. And this is a hybrid plan. We're going to monitor the mitigation site annually, twice, spring and fall, so we capture both the temperate and the tropical species. We'll do species composition, frequency, and cover. We'll also do water quality and bathymetry surveys annually. The water quality will be done twice annually, along with the seagrass surveys. We'll incorporate drone surveys to photograph the site. And then we've also proposed that this particular site could become a potential sentinel site in the AppNet monitoring program. And all of these protocols that we're using are consistent with our coastwide monitoring program that's facilitated by the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Partnership. So what are our success criteria? We're proposing that we'll have 40% seagrass coverage. That will be 40% of the reference site by year 3, 60% by year 4, and by year 5, we're proposing that to be acceptable to meet the criteria. We'd have 75% of the seagrass coverage in the reference areas. And right now, failure to meet the success criteria stated above would result in an extended monitoring and reporting timeline until the criteria are met. But at the moment, there are no explicit contingency plans, which I suspect will be negotiated when the final plan is accepted. And this is something that we really should talk about as a group, is what are appropriate contingency plans for any mitigation project. So what can we contribute to improving seagrass mitigation? Helping develop appropriate site selection protocols. What are the appropriate monitoring metrics that we can suggest? What are performance standards that are acceptable for any project? That includes this idea of what is an appropriate ratio to replace the impacted habitat. How should we approach the idea of contingency plans? And of course, related to contingency plans is this matter of financial assurances that any contingency would be implemented. And I'll stop there.
Perfect. Well done. Thanks, Judd. I think it builds on some of the other conversations we've already had for sure, and some of the other presentations we'll have. And I think we've got time for one question. Phil, if you want to unmute, chime in.
Yeah, so it's more of a comment than a question. So Judd, thank you for that. Thank you especially for laying out the regulatory history of how we are, how we got to where we are today. I wanted to just add on to that. So avoid, minimize, and mitigate is definitely a principle that all federal agencies follow. But not all federal agencies have the same authority under the Clean Water Act. So EPA actually has veto authority under the permitting provisions of 404. And so when we're looking at a project, our first test is there significant degradation resulting from that project or not? And if the answer is yes, mitigation does not offset that decision. So in shorthand, we call it, mitigation doesn't cure a flunk. So if your project results in significant degradation, the project is done. We would veto the permit. We only allow mitigation for projects that do not result in significant degradation, but do require some offsetting of impacts. So I think that's an important distinction that I just wanted to point out.
Thanks, Phil. So I think we're going to move forward in our agenda for today. So next up, Forrest will be giving a rundown on, speaking of site selection models. During the steering committee, we kind of had a chat about those groups that have site selection models and how they're being used, areas that there's still some gaps in knowledge in our data sets. So soils and light being one of those two of those key aspects. So Forrest, you should be able to share your screen.
Thanks. Yeah, I am in the midst of working on it, so I'm just shuffling some windows around on my desktop here. Oh. Okie dokie. I'm seeing a full screen slide.
Yes, that's what we see as well.
Excellent. Whatever. That's actually Kay Evans. So yeah. Who invited me to present at this meeting. So I thought it was fitting that I start off with a nice picture of her underwater here. Judd, thanks for that great that talk, and I think that it really sets up this talk that I'm doing well, as you suggested, and others. That we're going to talk a little bit about site selection here in Massachusetts as related to mitigation. And I also thought that that background on kind of where we're coming from with mitigation is helpful. I don't actually have those slides in my talk, so I'm going to. That was a nice. I appreciate you covering that base for me. Okay, so great. All right, so starting with in Massachusetts, why did we look into this site selection? And really in Massachusetts, the way that mitigation has been working for maybe a little over a decade now is we have this program called the In Lieu Fee program here, and it's through the Army Corps of Engineers permits, but then it's administered by the Department of Fish and Game here in Massachusetts. And basically what happens is that we have an impact, and if mitigation isn't possible kind of in kind and in place, so what there's an option for now is to pay funds into this in lieu fee program, kind of like a bank or a pipeline, and then those funds, folks can apply for projects that would mitigate the impacted resources and the resource areas, whether that's seagrass, that would be a subtitle, marine impact, and then the idea is that those funds then go out and ultimately result in the resource being restored. And again, there's these there's ratios, and some of the idea here is that, especially for these smaller projects, mitigating, fraction of an acre isn't always that feasible. So if we can pool funds to kind of support kind of a larger project, maybe that can give us more return on our investment. And there's some literature there suggesting that's the case as well, where especially for seagrasses, the size of a restoration can be related to its success. But what's actually kind of happening and in this state is that this pipeline is a little bit broken, and we're getting funds kind of stacked up in the LUFI program, and there's just not a real not enough projects or people applying to use these funds, or they're not getting approved. And so there's kind of a number of reasons why this could happen. But back when we started this project, almost I think it was in 2017, 2016, DMF had been approached to see whether we could help with these funds that help actually turn this money into on the ground resources that was kind of building up. And we didn't have any sites at that time ready for restoration, and so we thought, well, maybe one thing that's holding up these mitigation funds is that there aren't either sites available, or maybe there are available sites but folks haven't been able to identify them. So we thought maybe a site selection model could help kind of free up that blockage in the pipeline. And I just, on the right hand figure here, we've been using site selection models for a long time, and I'm actually going to talk about some of Fred Short's work in a couple slides. But basically there's but typically we do this at kind of like an embayment or estuary, or a kind of a relatively smaller scale compared to like the state scale. And that involves kind of collecting some environmental data, whether that's sediment characteristics, depth, or light, temperature, all those things, as well as kind of test plotting. So here's just an example of a restoration in a restoration site selection model for Salem Sound, which in the right hand corner is a little small. So you can see what that's a really kind of, I mean, it's a large area, but it's a small area relative to the whole Massachusetts coastline up there. So we've kind of been doing this on a small scale to site restoration. We were wondering whether could we expand this approach to statewide to help kind of again address kind of availability and identifying sites for restoration, which is at the kind of state scale, which is where the LUFI program is working at. So the approach was kind of a multi-phase approach. There's three, and I'll start the first two here. One was building kind of a desktop model using available data sets, mostly GIS. So that included, and I guess I would say again, as I mentioned, we based this on Fred Short and others' work, and the idea was again looking at some exclusion areas here in orange or red. So that's existing eelgrass, mooring fields, dredge areas, and aquaculture areas. So just kind of cutting out those areas from as potential sites. We also were able to look at depth and fetch, and so those were kind of, we had specific ranges of those variables where we wanted to include areas that met those characteristics. And then we also looked into some sediment or soil classification and historic eelgrass. Ultimately, we weren't able to add those in due to some issues with kind of resolution and accuracy. And so that kind of rounded out the desktop approach. And ultimately, we got kind of these, you can see on the right hand side, this is for Boston Harbor, just a subset of the model, with the green area being where we are, very, very simplistic, I would say, site selection model is indicating as potentially suitable for eelgrass. So then from these kind of areas, we used our best kind of professional judgment to kind of drill into some more variables, which were light and temperature, which we did using these field deployed sensors. We also looked at soils, organic content, and grain size. And we did that for a subset of 13 sites throughout the coast. Okay. And so then we also at these 13 sites, the third phase is, assuming those, or when those, both the desktop model and the field sensing methods came back as suggesting there's potential for eelgrass to thrive at those sites. We then went out and deployed test plots. So again, these stars along the Massachusetts coastline here are the test plot locations, and these were planted and monitored for up to 2 years. And we used the adult shoot transplant method, and again, targeting eelgrass from really as close by as we could get it in healthy natural meadows, which is kind of I would say the status quo approach in Massachusetts. All right. So quickly, just some results on starting with the desktop model. So just to walk you through this figure, I've split out the Massachusetts coastline by the 8 embayments that DEP here in Massachusetts uses to map eelgrass. And the reason I've done this just is to give you a sense of like the size of the coastline and how what our model is doing relative kind of the total area of coastline we potentially have that folks should be looking into. And so the blue lines here are the area of these different colored shaded areas for each one. And you'll see that some of them are over 100,000 acres. So there's a lot of area out there where DEP is looking for eelgrass. And so if you think about like the complete novice coming in, could be potential restoration areas. So then the green bars here are the areas that our desktop model identified as suitable. And so we are, cutting down a lot of area, even just with very simple kind of depth and exposure parameters. And so that is, in some ways encouraging. Hopefully will help, direct folks in the right direction. But on the flip side, we're still, many of these many of these kind of sub areas or models identifying over, thousands of acres, almost in every case of potential suitable habitat. And most restorations, as Judd was saying, are in the order of a large restoration in Massachusetts would be in the order of single acres. So that's a lot of area still to cover and to look at. And so we're not like we weren't able to narrow things down necessarily to identify specific sites. So again, as I said, we kind of used our best judgment to try to identify some potential areas where to look at temperature and light and these other conditions in more depth. And here are the results from our test plots and kind of field recon. So I've color coded the stars here as based on what happened. So just from kind of top to bottom, 2 of our sites, we actually went in the field and found that there was unmapped eelgrass at that site. So that was interesting, and at least suggested even with these simple parameters, we're picking up eelgrass habitat, and so that was interesting. And then but obviously we didn't pursue that site any farther. It already had eelgrass. There were a couple sites then that after kind of monitoring, we didn't end up pursuing test plots, and that was for a number of different kind of reasons. But then for the majority of sites where we did do test plots, they all failed in the order of months. And the best we had was that one, we have kind of a single shoots kind of hanging on after 2 years, but nothing that kind of met our criteria of success, which would be kind of expanding density and high survival rates. So
just to interrupt quickly for us,
yeah.
you got just a couple minutes left.
Sure, thanks. So, I think what getting to conclusions, thankfully we're there. So there's some time for questions. What I don't want to say is that, desktop site selection is useless, or that, eelgrass restoration, is not happening in Massachusetts. I think that's what we shouldn't conclude. But, in terms of next steps, I think that the desktop approach really highlighted where, having some of these key parameters like light and temperature for eelgrass and soils at the both the scale of the statewide scale, but at the kind of fine scale resolution needed for restoration is a real challenge. Hoping that we're continuing to improve our remote sensing products, and we're continuing to look into this in Massachusetts and whether there are remote sensing tools we can use to help us get a sense for these characteristics at, again, this scale, this combination of scale and resolution with the challenge. Secondly, I think even when we have this data for sites, it can be challenging to identify or take that data and translate it into a success or failure a recommendation. And that's because these stressors, whether it's and work by Jillian Dunich here, showing that temperature and light are actually interacting in terms of their effects on eelgrass growth. I think we also it's hard to think about how environmental variation, both through time, and that's both like seasonally, these plants are in very different environments, and where they're moving around this kind of growth surface is interesting. They're definitely, even at most, optimal site, they're probably not in optimal growth all the time. So trying to understand that and map that out. And then also, there's also interannual, and right now we're warming here in the Northeast quite rapidly, and so that kind of changing baseline as well through time is a challenge. And then finally, I'll mention, a lot of our models are our kind of understanding of seagrass suitability is at a species level, but there is interspecific variation, and so trying to whether we can incorporate that into suitability is another challenge, I think. And then finally, it's talking, I think, is about scaling up capacity. And the way we've been restoring eelgrass in Massachusetts with adult vegetative shoots predominantly requires a lot of expertise and very specific kind of skill set, and often divers. And so it hasn't been something that many people have been able to get involved in because of those challenges. But we're hoping to look into other opportunities, especially around seeds, trying to up our capacity, up the number of people who can actually do this work. And that's another thing we're hoping to kind of build in going forward is getting more people involved to get more people to try restoration, because it's such a huge, Massachusetts is not a big state, but it's a big coastline, and the more people we can get out there, I think trying stuff is going to help us meet our ambitious restoration goals at the state scale. So, all right, thank you. Hopefully I have a little bit of time for questions. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Forrest. No, unfortunately not time. Feel free to put questions in the chat if anyone has a question and they want to pop it in there. We do have, as promised, a break period, which now maybe we'll fill with people wanting to answer questions. But a lot of great content, and I think, like you said, rolled quickly from Judd's to your presentation, and now we're kind of getting a broader scale picture from Phil, so just more about mitigation within this Northeast region. And some additional challenges, strategies, approaches. Take it away, Phil. You're muted, Phil. You're still muted, and you're in presenter mode. But we see your lovely photos and graphics.
Unmute. Okay. Can you hear me now?
We can, yes. And you're still in
Okay.
presenter mode, though.
Display setting. You got it.
Team effort. Thanks.
All right. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the good, the bad, the ugly of eelgrass mitigation in New England over the course of my career. I think Judd and Forrest kind of set this talk up well. So I'm going to highlight just a few of the larger projects in New England. I want to thank Tay Evans and Alyssa Novak for their help in recreating some of the history here. And as I go through this, some of these projects led to either policy or science changes in the way we do mitigation here in New England. So that's why I picked these specific ones. So the first one is Portsmouth Port Development Project was proposed in the late 80s, early 90s, impacting about 2 acres, or proposed to impact about 2 acres of eelgrass in the lower Piscataqua River. In this case, and this was unusual, especially at the time, we required upfront mitigation, which meant that mitigation needed to be done prior to the construction being done. And the applicant actually agreed to that, which again was not the normal way things worked for wetlands projects in general. This is a Fred Short effort. He and many students successfully restored over 6 acres at various locations within the Piscataqua River and some of the tributaries. Again, as Jed pointed out, we're looking at a 3-to-1 ratio here, restoring eelgrass to the amount that was impacted. This was also incredibly unusual, and this was a state requirement. They required a 15-year post-construction monitoring period, which is unheard of. Most federal permits, you're lucky if you get 3 to 5 years. New Hampshire DES required this 15-year post-construction monitoring. A gentleman named Frank Richardson, who has long since retired, this was his brainchild, and was a great addition to this project because it led to multiple students getting degrees doing this work. Tay Evans, Alyssa Novak, Ryan Davis, Jeff Gakel, and a bunch of others you may know, all did work on some or all of this post-construction monitoring. So that was kind of a additional side benefit to this mitigation plan. And a lot of important science was done as well. And this was the first time we really started thinking about green crabs and their impacts to eelgrass mitigation. So Ryan Davis, Fred, I think Dave Burdick have published on the impact of green crabs to restored or transplanted eelgrass. Forrest showed you the Fred paper on site selection models, and Fred also was really the first one to develop success criteria for our permits here in this region. And then Tay and Fred put out a great paper on the functional recovery trajectory. So how do the ecosystem services recover through time? What's the lag time before these restored beds start acting like native beds? And I did want to point out, and this is this has never been Fred never published on this, but I was looking through my files in preparation for this and found that this was seen elsewhere. When we manipulate the environment, we don't always get the intended consequences. And I remember going out with Fred. He wanted to show me, he had put up these cages to keep the green crabs out of his transplant sites. And so he had put in oak stakes and essentially gill nets that were several feet high, and basically fenced off like a 1/4 acre of seafloor, and it had done adult shoot transplanting in that fenced off area. And he's like, I really want to show you this. I'm really proud of the way this has gone. I think it's going to be great. And we get out there, and there's no eelgrass to be seen within the caged off area. And we walk in. It's at a low tide. We walk in, and all of the shoots were pulled underground by sea worms because he had effectively kept the green crabs out and kept their predators away. And the worms took advantage of it and pulled everything below ground, and I don't think they're feeding on the seagrass, but feeding on the epiphytes. And there's a paper that I found that talked about the same thing happening in Sweden. So really interesting. He also Fred developed and published on the horizontal rhizome method and something called turfs, which turfs were developed for two reasons. And turfs, people have not seen them or used them. They are these cages that they're basically cut off lobster cages at the end that are weighted. And the reason they were developed was Fred was looking for one crab deterrent. Felt like these cages would provide a little bit more stability to the adult shoots and maybe prevent crabs from uprooting or shearing them. But also, he wanted to get away from people actually having to dive. And so you could have people, non-divers, actually participate, put together these frames on the shoreline, and that's Tay Evans on the left supervising as I actually do the work. Um, and um, and then they can just be walked out into shallow water and deployed that way. And so this technique has been used in multiple projects throughout New England, although it's kind of fallen out of favor a little bit. One of the challenges with this technique is these frames would go out, you leave them for 3 weeks. You hope the plants root after that period of time, and then you would take them out. And unless you're incredibly careful, sometimes the roots would overgrow the lattice of the frame. And so when you're pulling the frame out, you're pulling out all, some of your transplanted shoots as well. The ties are supposed to be biodegradable, so that after 3 weeks to a month, they would no longer be holding the plants to the frame. That sometimes happened, not always. So there are some issues with it. The frames themselves are they're not expensive, but that's an additional cost if you're going to do something at any kind of scale. Next, I want to talk about the hub line. So the hub line was a natural gas pipeline that was built from Salem, Massachusetts to Boston, and 24 miles of construction. And during this process, one of the key issues that came up was knowing the limitations of your maps. And so the contractors for this company came in, they looked at the state DEP eelgrass maps, which we told them were an excellent representation of the general coverage, but you need to do a site-specific survey. And they, yeah, sure, we'll get to that. They never, by the time they got to the site-specific survey and they realized that their pipeline was going to clip about, I think it was 1.6 or 2 acres of eelgrass in Salem Sound, it was too late for them to deviate their route, and so they put a little bit too much faith in those maps, which are not intended for site-specific use. And it says that on the cover of the website, that site-specific surveys need to be done to verify all of these delineations. So they ended up with a 1.5 to 2 acre impact, and a successful 5 acre restoration was done in Boston Harbor. And Tay Evans and Allison Leshin were the two drivers behind that. But one of the really key things of that effort was, a lot of us focus on light and water quality. But when you're dealing with urban harbors, equally important, if not maybe more so important, is the importance of sediment conditions. And I think a lot of effort for this particular mitigation project went into identifying the proper sediment conditions in Boston Harbor, which was a challenge. Unfortunately, after a successful restoration, we found out that just because you restored eelgrass doesn't mean it's going to stay there forever. And the city of Boston proposed and actually built a pier over this part of this restoration effort, several years after it was completed, and kind of bisected that meadow. All right, I want to go now to another area of Boston Harbor. This is Logan Airport safety ramp. So at the end of runway 22, the airport was required to build by the FAA something called inclined safety ramp, which was to, if planes ended up going off the end of the runway, the safety ramp would slow them down and keep them out of the water, or if they landed short of the runway, they wouldn't end up in the water. And back in the 70s, a plane in Logan did actually go off the runway. The front of the plane snapped off. 2 people sitting in first class fell out, and their bodies were never found. So it was not a hypothetical. It was actually much needed project, and they're actually doing it on some of the other runways now that don't have eelgrass. So we advised Massport, which is the entity that runs Logan Airport, to do test plots throughout Boston Harbor to see where they could actually potentially transplant eelgrass as part of their mitigation. And many of the test plots in most of the harbor showed pretty low survival. The area that had the highest level of survival was actually, maybe not surprisingly, near the impact location. So near the northern part of the harbor, where the water flushing in and out of Boston Harbor is pretty good. Water clarity tends to be better. But unfortunately, the FAA has a policy that they will not pay for mitigation that around airports that are qualified as bird attractants. And so Massport had a 10,000 foot exclusion zone in every direction around this their facility that they could not actually do the mitigation. So, at the time there's about 50 acres of eelgrass at the end of this runway, and we thought planting another a couple of acres would not substantially change the bird attractant quality of that area, but FAA didn't agree, and so Massport decided to, even though the test plots showed low survival, they decided they wanted to go ahead with transplanting in the southern part of the harbor, which we assisted with. We were diving off the end of runway 22, pulling up lots of chutes within the footprint of the impact area as jets were landing right over our head at the time. And Massport spent about $500,000 doing this. And not surprisingly, all these transplants failed. We did have a contingency plan in the permit. If plan A didn't work, plan B was to put in 265 conservation moorings statewide at another cost of about another $500,000. And for people that don't know what conservation moorings are or why we put them in, this is, I think Tay Evans had given me this photo, and this might be the Bahamas, but it gives you an idea of what moorings do. The dark area, obviously seagrass. These donut holes are result from the scouring of the chains.
Sorry to interrupt, Phil, if you want to kind of wrap it up with the next minute
Yep.
or so.
Yeah. So, conservation moorings. Conservation moorings basically keep the chain off the bottom and allow eelgrass to grow back. The last one I'll talk about is Portland Harbor dredging. This is again another upfront mitigation effort. and they removed or replaced 275 moorings in eelgrass. And I went out and dove on a bunch of them last summer. 6 out of the 8 moorings showed eelgrass growing right back up to the mooring block or the helical screw anchor. Forrest talked about the inland fee program, mentioned it, currently in place in both Maine and Massachusetts. As he said, the original concept was pooling mitigation dollars from lots of small projects. But there's problems, no in-kind or on-site requirements necessary. Demonstrated success is needed, which I think tends to scare people away when we're talking about seagrass. There's also a capacity or expertise lacking in Maine at the moment. And as far as it showed, a lack of site selection models or information also can be a problem. And just to add a little humor to this, mitigation is stressful for both the regulators and the regulated communities because we don't know if it's going to work. And so it's not a great model necessarily. And I will take any questions.
Thanks so much, Phil. So we're going to push on and get to our last presentation. There is a break scheduled. We will preserve the sanctity of the break and kind of push into our discussion time, but we're going to see how quickly Brooke can get through her her slides. Giving an idea too, it's good segue into our session after the break, where we're getting at some of the questions that she recently asked with the Chesapeake Bay Working Group, and trying to align some of the concepts and strategies with mitigation. So take it away, Brooke.
All right, hold tight. I lost my, uh-oh. My screen just went completely blank. Hold on.
We can see
What
your screen, at least your slide. Oh,
all I
now
can
it's
see.
out of, oh,
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
yes.
I have no idea what's happening. This is so weird. Hold tight. Am I back in the display?
You're in the normal presenter mode. You're good to go from here.
Okay. All right. Good.
Oh,
A
now you're out
moment
of it.
Really? Oh my goodness. I was good to go a second ago.
It was.
Am I in presenter mode now?
You're in the where we can see
Oh,
your
Lord.
presenter notes. So you want to go?
Yep. Sorry.
It's okay.
Always fun. Come on. Okay.
This looks normal. We look good.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Have at it.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so I am, hi everyone, Brooke Landry with Maryland DNR and the Chesapeake Bay program. I am going to be talking a little bit more in the nitty-gritty detail of SAV mitigation. Within the Chesapeake Bay and within Maryland, we have been seeing more requirements for in-kind SAV mitigation. Mostly because we keep recommending that instead of out-of-kind mitigation. That we have a history of allowing for out-of-kind mitigation for SAV impacts. If, for example, if somebody puts in a living shoreline and it impacts SAV, historically, the living shoreline was considered self-mitigating for those SAV impacts. But we have been pushing for, no, if you are impacting SAV, you need to mitigate SAV. Like everyone else, we require a 3-to-1 ratio right now for SAV mitigation or for any kind of in-kind mitigation. So if you impact an acre, you have to restore 3 acres. So this has led to some concerns, some confusion about how to actually do it, what to actually require, how to monitor these projects, which metrics to survey, all sorts of questions. And so the regulatory agencies in Maryland and Virginia requested that the SAV work group for the Chesapeake Bay program come up with a mitigation guidance document, or, just a list of recommendations for what we think should be required based on our SAV expertise. And so we started working on this within the work group. We talked about it, we conferred internally, but we kept on coming up with these questions that could not be answered without the presence of the actual regulatory agency reps present. So that approach didn't work, where we tried to figure it out internally. And so we decided that the best approach would be to hold a full day workshop, where we had all of our SAV restoration folks in the room, along with a whole handful of our regulatory folks. So the people that are actually out there writing the permits, making the decisions, making the final requirements on what is going to be included in your license agreement. So this actually went really well. We had a full day of really engaged conversation. We used a facilitator, which I highly recommend for this sort of thing, because, we were just talking in circles internally. But once we had a facilitator at this workshop, it really, really helped just kind of move things along and, push us towards making concrete decisions. So the mitigation workshop included, we did our welcome and introductions, we did an overview of the workshop objectives, and then we had presentations by our state regulatory agency partners. We had 3 of those, and then we went into a panel discussion with those presenters. We took a lunch break, and then we started answering the many, many questions that had come up during their presentations and beforehand. And then we closed the day with a consensus building exercise that the facilitator really proved incredibly worthwhile for that portion especially. Then we wrapped it up. So our 3 regulatory presentations included a presentation from the Maryland Department of the Environment, who does, a lot of our, permitting. Of course, NOAA did a presentation. John Watson, I think he's online now, did a presentation on the larger federal regulations and, how they go about recommending SAV mitigation. And then we had the Maryland Board of Public Works Wetlands Administration present how they are incorporated into this whole process. So it's a big, confusing process, to say the least, but we were tasked with getting to the nitty gritty of the actual mitigation and the restoration and what should be required. So I'm not going to go into the details of how, they structure their decision making and whatnot. We've heard a lot about that already anyway. And so what we did was we took a handful of questions that came up. So things like, what size impact should trigger SAV mitigation? How do we determine if in-kind SAV mitigation is actually appropriate at that time? If SAV is trending up, yes. If SAV is trending down in an area, should we actually require mitigation when we know it'll likely fail? What characteristics make for a suitable SAV mitigation project site? How far away from the impact site is allowable for mitigation for the mitigation site? And then how far away from that do you want a reference site? What characteristics should that reference bed have? How do you identify a donor bed for your seeds or your transplants? We work mostly with seeds in Chesapeake Bay. We're not doing very much whole shoot or adult shoot transplantation. What monitoring metrics and frequency? How should mitigation projects be tracked and for how long? And who's responsible for that? What should be required for long-term maintenance? Again, who's responsible? Kind of a redundant question. And then crucially, how do we determine project success? And should we require financial assurances? So we went very high tech with how we approach this, and we put giant sticky notes all over the conference room wall and had folks, write on their little post-it notes, or else just directly on the sticky notes. Those were like big, like 2 by 3 feet size stickies. And we took a break and allowed for folks to just get up, wander around. They did this over lunch. Whenever the mood struck, they would get up and write their opinion on the sticky notes. And this allowed people, that had opinions that maybe didn't want to like voice them, had maybe controversial opinions, they could just kind of covertly write what they wanted to on the notes addressing each of the questions. And then, of course, we had a lot of stuff that wasn't there, thoughts and concerns and questions that didn't necessarily fit into any of the topics that we had written on the sticky notes. And so we had a parking lot that we called the SAV bed for additional thoughts, anything that didn't fall into those categories. So with these sticky notes, nope, back one. With these giant pile of sticky notes, I have, all these rolled up in my office at work. And thank goodness got Caitlin to take pictures of all of them so I could, look at them on the computer and then start translating them into this document. It's dated April 1st. It's not actually finished yet. I'm hoping to have it finished by May 1st. But this is going to be the guidance document that we provide to our regulatory agencies for what the SAV work group recommends that they require. These will just be recommendations. We can't require that they require these things. So it's just, take it as they may, but since they've been asking for it, I'm hoping they will take the advice with it. It also needs to be circulated back through the people that participated in the workshop again to make sure that everything was captured and captured correctly, and that, I'm not going off on any random tangent that people don't agree with. So this document will be available at some point here soon, hopefully within the next month or so. But I'm going to quickly go through what is included in the document and the recommendation that we made on each, that we're going to make, barring complication or disagreement on each of these questions. So the first one was, what size impact should trigger an SAV mitigation? So we had a lot of discussion around this, and one of the main suggestions was that we do a literature search to find out what other states are actually requiring before we say for sure what our recommendation is. And one of our members with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation put together a nice little table with hyperlinked sources on what other states do require. At this point, there are lots, obviously, where she couldn't find any information. They might not have anything to do with SAV mitigation. But we found anything from, anything over 0, any impact at all for Washington and New Hampshire would trigger SAV mitigation up to an acre. So New Jersey and Louisiana say, like, the minimum trigger would be an acre. In discussion during the workshop, we talked to some of our restoration crew. Stephanie Hall, I think you're on here. She was mentioning that they do 10 by 10 restoration plots, and they usually do 3 together, and that they have seen those plots, succeed and spread. And so with that and the 0 minimum acres that other states use, we figure a 300 square foot minimum impact is what we will recommend to trigger SAV mitigation. Smaller than that, maybe, maybe no requirement, but anything over 300 feet should require SAV mitigation. And that 300 square foot mitigation would then, of course, require a 900 square foot restoration project. This is still a very small restoration project, so there could be discussions about bundling these together, building them up over time, continuously adding to a mitigation bank project, something along those lines. But this is what we're recommending for that minimum. And then, of course, how do we determine if in-kind SAV mitigation is appropriate at the time? Lots of thoughts on that, but ultimately we're recommending, obviously, avoid impacts, minimize impacts. If you can't avoid, same as everyone else. And if you must still have an impact, then of course mitigate it. But if conditions are trending down in a tributary, mitigate within that region or salinity zone, not necessarily in that tributary. And if conditions are trending down in the region or zone, defer mitigation and explore in lieu fee payment instead. So we do have a tidal wetlands mitigation compensation fund in Chesapeake Bay, and we do require payment for SAV impacts if you don't mitigate. So they could pay into that in lieu fee instead. Those payments aren't always necessarily used for SAV mitigation, which we're trying to work out with MDE, who oversees it. So we're trying to, require them to hold that money for SAV specific projects instead of other projects. And they're willing, and we're working towards an agreement on that. So then what characteristics make for a suitable SAV mitigation project site? So a lot of this we have this small scale SAV restoration in Chesapeake Bay technical guidance document that we put together several years ago. I think it was published in 2019 now. So we say, you know, follow the recommendations in that book for restoration site selection first, and then of course prioritize sites based on meeting and exceeding SAV habitat requirements. That's the table down here in the lower right, which comes from our technical synthesis 2 document. You know, low wave energy, but some movement, shoreline and land use conducive to SAV. Natural for both is preferred. You don't want to do SAV restoration necessarily up against an urban shoreline, for example. And of course, low boat traffic. So sites should have historical presence of SAV, but none or low density only presently. You don't want to, you know, do SAV mitigation where there's a successful SAV bed growing at the time. So that's the guidance that we are recommending on that. How far away from the impact site is allowable for the mitigation site? So an SAV mitigation site must be as close as possible to the impact site without risk of impact from the project. Sometimes that nearness is not possible, so we're just suggesting prioritize as follows, you know, near the site, and then within the tributary, and then within a nearby tributary, and at the very least within the region, and of course within the same salinity zone.
Brooke,
So
if you want to try and wrap up in the next couple minutes.
Oh, okay. I'll try. Okay, so how far away from the mitigation is allowable for reference? Similar, you want it to be close to the mitigation site because you want them to be, you know, similar style beds. You know, reference sites should be within the same tributary, if not possible, and nearby within the same salinity zone. But the sites should support the same species community, obviously, or the dominant species, and have overall similar characteristics, including salinity substrate and other abiotic characteristics. You know, the reference bed should have, like I just said, same abiotic and biotic characteristics. That was kind of a redundant question, but distance versus characteristics. How do you identify a donor bed? A lot of what we've heard about today is full plant transplants, but we work with seeds here primarily in Chesapeake Bay. And we listed out the requirements for a donor bed. You know, it should be at least 5 years old. 75% or more of the plants should be reproductive. They should be dense beds, whole 9 yards. And then, of course, here you have to apply for a permit to harvest that SAV, and that is done through Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and I oversee those permits. Monitoring metrics and frequency, talked about this as well. You know, we're looking at shoot counts, cover class, percent cover, and the size of the restored bed. So wrapping all that up into your survey methodology. How should mitigation projects be tracked and for how long? Who is responsible? We are recommending 5 years for monitoring. So, you know, the time the mitigation project goes in for an additional 5 years should be conducted by a qualified and a third party and independent contractor for those 5 years. And then after that, theoretically in perpetuity using VIMS data, but not necessarily by the licensee. So all spatial data and survey data should be submitted to DNR and must submit timestamp pictures also to assure validity and accuracy of their monitoring results. So you don't want whoever put in the mitigation project necessarily to be the one doing the monitoring unless they can supply that extra, that, you know, the pictures to make sure that they're not fudging their results and saying it's successful when it's not actually successful. So long-term maintenance, again, very similar. And then this is a big one. How do you determine project success? So we went back and forth on this many times, whether, you know, it should look like the mitigation, or I'm sorry, the impact site, or whether it should look like a reference bed. Ultimately, we are recommending that we follow the guidance by Gamble et al. 2021, comparing restored beds to reference beds. So this takes into account regional trends. It doesn't hold the permittee accountable to impossible standards. So if, you know, if something happens in that watershed or, you know, in the region, if, you know, the SAV is just trending down, generally and trending down at that reference bed, then we're not going to hold the permittee responsible for having this, wildly successful mitigation project when SAV is tanking elsewhere. So, the metrics and the way it works, you compare a quality ratio to a threshold value. And if the quality ratio is over the threshold value, the project is considered successful. And if it is not, it is considered a failure and would require some sort of contingency. So, you do a year 1 survey, a year 2 survey, or a year 3 survey. If you're failing, replant if necessary. Then survey again in years 4 and 5. And it's either successful or not. And if not, you got your contingency plan. Financial assurance is something else we discussed. This is a little tricky. A lot of places get very wary of financial assurance, but we did discuss, escrow accounts or some sort of other financial assurance. But we are recommending that that would be ideal. But if that is impossible, some sort of letter of commitment or agreement should be required to ensure follow-up or contingency if the project is a failure. And then things that went into the SAV bed, all sorts of questions there, but things like we need an SAV restoration certification program. I think Forrest hit on this. We need more trained professionals that know how to do SAV restoration. It's a complicated process. Not anybody can just go out there and do it, even if they have a little booklet that tells them how to. We need training in this. We need to track our restoration projects better. We don't track them particularly well in Chesapeake Bay, and we're working on that. We need to establish a specific in lieu fee for SAV mitigation, not that SAV, payments made for SAV impacts should not go to other, resources or mitigation projects. Overall, we need to make it cheaper so that it's more feasible. And there are lots of things to take into consideration, like balancing our need for SAV mitigation with shoreline protection, so living shorelines and things like that. Anyway, so lots of stuff in our workshop, and I will stop there. I don't know
Thank
if
you,
I got
Brooke.
that done in the time frame, but
Not at all, but it's okay.
okay.
Let's just say thank you to Judd and to Forrest, to Phil and to yourself, to everyone, the 4 of you for presenting today. A wealth of knowledge and really a diverse suite of things that I feel like they're coalescing on some of the similar themes that we're going to tackle when we come back from our break. And so you'll notice in the agenda that we're looking at many of those same questions that Brooke just presented from the working group. So 2 housekeeping things. If you were late to join us, please put your name and affiliation in the chat. And then the second is, and there are a couple questions in there. If you have questions for the presenters, please go ahead and put them in there. Presenters, please take a gander. There's a couple questions in there that I think you could probably answer. It is 3:42. Please have a bio break and come back at 3:52. Oh, sorry, I'm in a different time zone.
10:42.
My time zone's a bit different. Yeah, come back in 10 minutes.
Thanks, Sue.
Yeah. All right, welcome back, folks. We're going to get started here with our group discussion.
All right.
Whatever time it is, morning, afternoon.
It is 10:52 on the East Coast of the United States. All right. Well, thanks everybody. And thank you, Jesse and Z, for running this meeting so far. I'm going to take over on this last component for the SAV mitigation discussion. So pretty much, we have that list of questions that we included in the agenda. Those are things that came up during the last steering committee meeting. I unfortunately was not able to make that meeting, so I'm not overly familiar with what was discussed besides reading through the minutes. But those were the sorts of things that folks were interested in discussing at this meeting. And of course, since we didn't have a lot of time for questions following presenter presentations, if you have any questions that you have on hold, or they put on hold after those presentations, feel free to raise your hand. I think I can see it when everybody's hands are up. So, put your hand up. I think that is if you go to the React bar at the bottom and click on that, you can raise your hand. So use that, or just come off mute and holler at us and get our attention. So that works too. So with that, does anybody have any questions first and foremost? Follow-up questions. There are some questions in the chat also that I could bring up. Anybody? Judd's got a question. All right, Judd, go for it.
Yeah, it's not a question, and thanks a lot for all the other presentations. I'm really looking forward to seeing your document, Brooke, when that gets produced, because I think you're covering a lot of the stuff we heard today and a bunch of other things that I wasn't thinking about. So I get the feeling that we often confuse the terms mitigation and restoration, and I heard that today, and I think it's really important that there's an explicit delineation between the two because they are really two different activities. Mitigation is typically a reaction to an impact, and there's all sorts of regulatory framework around that. Restoration, it's a totally different concept. It's restoring something not necessarily associated with an impact, but so I think that was just kind of one general comment that I can make.
Great, thank you. Yeah, obviously, important distinction. So when we're talking about, mitigation and restoration, when you're doing the actual restoration project, I think that's when I kind of default to restoration techniques. So, Anne Deaton, your hand is raised.
Yeah, hi, I have a question. So in North Carolina, Judd talked about that, and in the past, the Division of Coastal Management, they're the primary regulatory agency, right? The umbrella agency that determines, runs the permit process. And they have it in their rules that mitigation is only allowed if there's overriding public benefit. And that's been applied to roads, bridges mostly, as Judd mentioned. But boat ramps, as far as I know, for Judd, I mean, that has not typically been considered a public benefit. And there's been a lot of discussion. Is that a public benefit? The project that is doing the mitigation for this, it's real political. It's not the norm. And the reason I mention that is wildlife is helping with the design, but they knew right away that there was SAV there beforehand, and they said they didn't want to be, buy it. They had an opportunity. So my question is, we don't really allow, honestly, in North Carolina, mitigation on a routine basis for SAV. And I'm wondering if the other states do. Once you have this official mitigation policy, does it actually encourage, more impacts to SAV? Because past, we've been able to hold the line and say, the agency say, no, SAV impact, it's, projects denied. But we are seeing more pressure, political pressure, to not say no to projects. So my question is, if we had that, some kind of mitigation policy and allowed it more, have you guys seen that it increases the impacts to SAV, I guess, where you have those programs?
So excellent question. Yeah, and I think, Judd, did you want to respond to that?
Well, no, I mean, Ann's right. I mean, this particular boat ramp was a special legislative appropriation of about $7.5 million that somebody obviously lobbied for. But what I wanted to also say in changes that are occurring in North Carolina, Ann is right historically. But one thing I've also noticed is there's been some recent projects where the actual specific mitigation plan is put on hold until the actual impact is determined. And this has been the case for bridges. So, it's all seems to be part of this evolution of widening the scope of mitigation, which isn't necessarily a good thing for this particular habitat.
Thanks, Judd. Megan, did you want to respond to that as well? Or did you have a different question?
Yeah, no, thanks. I was going to respond to Ann's comment about mitigation. If you have the requirement, will you just see more impacts? And from my experience in the Mid-Atlantic, we don't always see mitigation for every impact, but that hasn't stopped impacts. So that's my only my 2 cents there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I'll respond to that as well. And so I don't know if we've seen, like Megan said, I don't know if we've seen an increase in impacts. I know that we have lots of conflicting stuff going on in Chesapeake Bay with like living shorelines. And so we require living shorelines as the first option for shoreline control, erosion control. And it's the living shorelines that typically have some sort of SAV impact instead of, bulkheads or riprap. And so we are attempting to balance that to discourage just straight riprap. We're trying to encourage and require living shorelines, but they are routinely having more SAV impacts. So that's where we're getting into the mitigation and requiring mitigation for that. There's a lot of pushback on it, of course, but we do follow I think there are probably plenty of projects that don't get permitted because they do have SAV impacts. And historically, that was definitely the case. But yeah, I don't think there's an increase necessarily. I think we just have a mechanism for, offsetting those impacts now.
So in
Phil?
addition to, if I can just ask,
Yeah.
in addition to the living shoreline issue, because we're seeing that also, do you allow mitigation for private projects? So if somebody wants to dredge a channel, but it's not like a huge port, it's just like private ownership. Is that allowed?
So that's a whole different ball of worms. We do see dredging impacts all the time, and it depends on whether you have to go through the whole permitting process, obviously, as well for dredging, and the size of the project has a lot to do with it, and then whether it's a new dredge or a maintenance dredge plays into the permitting decision. So if it's a maintenance dredge, oddly, even if there are SAV impacts, you don't have to mitigate for those impacts because it's a historic channel used for navigation, and it's not required. You just get permitted to do the dredge work. If it's a new dredge and there are SAV impacts, you do have to mitigate for it. And there are cases where they might just deny it, but if it's, even if it's private property for navigational use, there's a lot of political pressure here to allow any sort of navigational access. We actually have a a regulation in place that you can remove SAV without a permit from your dock to the navigable channel in order to maintain access to that channel. So private citizens can just remove their SAV. There are requirements around it and they have to alert us now. And there's a size limit to how much they can remove, but totally allowable. So navigation gets a lot of priority. Phil, you had your hand up next, I think.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So to respond to Ann, this goes back to the point I tried to make after Judd's talk, where it's really important to separate assessing the impacts from the mitigation. So you make the decision first, is the project acceptable based on the impacts without consideration of mitigation at all? And if the answer is yes, then you go to the mitigation and you set that up so that the two are not. So I guess in New England, we're not seeing an increase of approving projects because of mitigation. It's a two-step process. And then, Brooke, interesting to what you said, in New England, it's a little bit different, where we have actually had people, we've convinced the New England Core District that for even maintenance dredging projects in certain circumstances, if there are SAV impacts, they need to mitigate. And the Corps has adopted this stance where if they haven't mitigated for the original dredging, they will do it once if it's maintenance. So we've gotten them to do that a couple of times now. So I wouldn't say it's a blanket exemption, at least on the federal level, for maintenance dredging at all.
Yeah, no, that was just with our state regs and policies, and our Board of Public Works is pushing against that, and they're trying to change that requirement and policy. So it's good to know that you all have been successful in that. So maybe we can follow suit and follow the example. Any other questions with regard to, or responses with regard to Ann's question about increased impacts with mitigation allowance? Before we move on. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and address a couple of the questions in the chat before I move on to what's in the agenda items. So one question was from Charlotte about being able to pay into SAV mitigation projects instead of running a mitigation project themselves. If the area impacted to mitigation area is 1 to 3, what is the recommended proportion of area impacted to pay in this regard? So I did not address that in my presentation, Charlotte. So right now, the Board of Public Works has set the in lieu fee for SAV mitigation or SAV impacts at $90,000 per acre. So it would be calculated out if you have, I believe the way it works is if you impact 1 acre, you would have to mitigate 3. And therefore, if you don't do the mitigation, you would have to pay 90,000 times 3. So I think I'm right on that. I should probably check, but I'm pretty sure you have to pay what would be required for mitigation instead of just for the impact itself. But right now we're at $90,000 per acre. Typically, what we've seen with SAV mitigation projects getting contracted out to companies, and I think Bob Murphy was on here earlier. He runs a lot of mitigation work through Tetra Tech here in Chesapeake Bay, and they charge around $100,000 an acre, give or take. That's like a very average ballpark figure, but it's around that amount. So the Board of Public Works is actually attempting to increase their in lieu requirement for SAV impacts to be more in line with current costs. What else do we see in
So, Brooke,
here?
I have a question about that. So
Sure.
what are the thresholds? How do they decide whether to accept the in lieu fee?
So that is if all other options are exhausted. So So when we were talking about in my slide about how to decide if SAV mitigation is appropriate, for example, if it doesn't look like it's going to be successful, if things are trending down, if for whatever reason mitigation is ixnayed, then they would go to the in lieu fee. So it's not just an easy peasy, well, we'll just pay that instead of doing the mitigation first. It's a,
So in other words, you have to go through the sequence: avoid,
yes, you have,
minimize, compensate. If you get to
exactly.
compensate and it's not practical or feasible or probable, then they'll allow this fee.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So it's like a fourth addition to the sequence.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Bob, your hand is up. Were you going to respond to that? What I called you out on?
You betcha. I'd feel compelled to.
Yeah, please.
Thanks.
Correct me if I'm
Just
wrong.
a clarification that that was kind of a rough back of the envelope calculation on a per acre basis,
Okay.
with a lot of the assumptions being that that's developing the mitigation plan, running it, getting it through regulatory, and then implementing it as well. And that's very scalable. That was, we estimated maybe on the high end at about 100K per acre. But if you did 4 acres, for example, it would jump to maybe like 130, or 140. It's just it's the initial upfront labor costs of seed collection and such. Once you start collecting for more acres, it's just it scales up very quickly.
Okay.
So just to make that
So you mean,
clarification. So
so
like
you
4
mean if
acres
you were to
wouldn't be
store,
$400,000. It's just not a straight multiplier.
okay, good, thank you.
Yeah. No
Well,
worries.
that's interesting because that is opposite the concept of the economy of scale.
No, that is the economy of scale. That's what my
Yeah, but-
point is that it gets less expensive per acre as you add more acreage.
Okay, so I misunderstood you then.
Yeah,
That makes
I'm sorry. Yeah, no, we got to clarify. Definitely the
Right.
economy of scale.
So that's with regard to the cost of doing the mitigation work, not for, if you impact more acres. The price
Right.
goes
It's
down
just
per acre.
strictly on the mitigation side. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right, Devin, you've got a question. I see you got a question about that kind of in the chat as well.
Yeah, it's more generally about using in lieu fee funds, not about determining how they can be used. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
So the main in lieu fee fund program is releasing some funding for eelgrass restoration this May, and has asked the main seagrass consortium to come up with some project ideas. And I just wanted to know if anyone here had experience or ideas for a different way of using those funds that could take into account the transient nature of eelgrass. We're worried that it's a very risk averse board in Maine, and we're worried that if we pick a small area that we won't be able to achieve our metrics of success. But if we expanded it out to an embayment, we could have we could demonstrate success even if the eelgrass moves or creates like a donor meadow further offshore. So I'm curious if anybody has experience in that kind of adaptive management geographical shift in using these funds. I know Phil talked about a contingency plan of using conservation moorings. We've also had some trouble in Maine with funds actually being returned to the in lieu fee program because eelgrass is no longer found in the area where conservation moorings were to be installed. And that had happened, before and also during some conservation mooring installs in a different project. So there's also some hesitancy from our in lieu fee program to do moorings for that reason. So we're looking kind of more toward that like geographical adaptation, and I'm wondering if anybody can speak to that as we're developing our project proposal over this next month.
I don't have any experience with that geographic question. Anybody else online have any response for Devin and how things have worked for you all?
So
Phil,
how
maybe?
much money do you have, Devin?
Sorry?
how much money do you have to spend?
Well, we haven't submitted the proposal yet. So the highest they've awarded is like up to 1.6 million, but the majority are in the 200,000 to 500,000 range.
Yeah. So I know, and Tay Evans is online, and we've talked about this in the past, and it doesn't qualify for in lieu fee, and you don't have the capital to really make a huge difference. But you know, improving water quality through stormwater control or sewer upgrades or whatever would be an excellent approach from a embayment wide, perspective. But in lieu fee program doesn't raise that type of capital to get at that. So I think you're really stuck with these smaller efforts of either transplanting seeding, the conservation moorings, or looking at other potential physical um, uh, impacts. So one of the things we've thought about elsewhere is creating like breakwaters, and similar to what Judd was doing in North Carolina, and allowing changing the hydrology to the benefit of the vegetation. So that, I don't know, that may be something that could be done within the dollar figures you're talking about.
Thanks, Phil. We had also talked about putting up maybe some conservation channels for boating. But yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, maybe also, one of the things that an issue that we have and an issue that I have with the way our in lieu fee works is that when we did come to an agreement with MDE, Maryland Department of the Environment, that they would set aside funds for SAV specific work. I was hoping that those funds could be used, in a creative sense to do things like build seed processing centers, or just in general increase capacity for SAV restoration work, build a nursery, build a training and certification program, or develop a training and certification program. All things that would ultimately go towards SAV restoration, but not actually be the restoration project themselves. And they put a limit on us that we actually had to use it for physical in the water, restoration project, unfortunately. So if you have any leeway and could do something like that might be worthwhile. Or we have an issue with people, and I think this is pretty universal with prop scars, people running through shallow water habitat and just tearing up SAV beds. So things like, funding SAV signage, like buoy markers, like shallow water area, beware of SAV, things like that might be worthwhile if that's allowable. We always have issues with that and issues getting funding for buoys, things like that. Elizabeth, were you going to respond to this?
Brooke, can I just add one
Nope.
thing to what you said? So I think
Sure.
the in lieu fee program requirements, both in Maine and Massachusetts, also require some in the water actual habitat restoration. That's a federal requirement as
Yeah.
part of any of these agreements. So you can do some stuff, but it has to have some component of actually in the water habitat restoration as part of it. I don't think that's really a thing we're ever going to get away from completely.
Yeah, that's understandable. Okay, now you, Elizabeth.
Thanks. Hi, Devin. I'm with the Massachusetts in lieu fee program. And as folks have suggested, we've really only used actual transplant of eelgrass or seed-based restoration to count for mitigation credit, but we've been able to have some flexibility in the areas where planting occurred by in this particular instance, funding was awarded to an organization that worked on Nantucket, and one of their initial sites didn't have the success that they had hoped for. And so we were able to move their additional planting to a different location that was also on Nantucket, so that they would still have the ability to do the monitoring and oversight. They are changing the agreement that they made with their harbor master to reflect the location where the second planting was happening as being the area that's restored, so that the original site can be kind of reopened to fishing and other activities that we had asked to be excluded from the restoration area during the monitoring period. And that will be marked with buoys and signs during the monitoring period. But then again, once that performance standards have been met, the signs and buoys will probably go away.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. I think Megan, you had your hand up next. Fitzgerald.
Yeah, thanks. Responding to Devin's question, I'm wondering, and I'm going to borrow some of this from, this is not my idea. I'm going to maybe poorly rephrase some conversations I've had with others about this, but then also pull in some concepts from the mitigation world as well. So mitigation banking and not in lieu fees. And so as far as your thought about how to, or your question about accounting for transient nature of seagrass, I'm wondering if there's, and I don't know your in lieu fee that well, so I don't know if there's a primary or secondary service area sort of concept here that we could consider. So if you have your, designated project area, this is where I want to plant, and this is where all my performance standards are and monitoring and whatnot. But if there's some sort of, and this is where I'm borrowing from somebody else. So if you're on the call, please, I hope, if you could maybe somehow model, like if you did nothing, what the amount, like the presence of seagrass and density would be versus what you're seeing now. So if you could somehow demonstrate that after your effort, there's more, and maybe it's not in that primary area, maybe it's a little bit further out. So maybe there are like levels. So I don't know if that's something you've considered, and maybe there's somebody on the call that can maybe poke holes in that. That'd be helpful. Maybe. So I'll do that.
Thanks, Megan. Anybody want to poke holes in that before I move on to Judd? All right. Judd.
Yeah, what's become really obvious to me and what I've been thinking about when I was thinking of organizing my presentation is, and Ann's comment was really good. Ann's comment goes all the way back to the 3 words that originally came out of the Clean Water Act, and that was no wetlands loss. And from there, we moved forward and the scope just started to expand and build. And then if you look at the guiding principles in NOAA's newest policy, and you look at the EPA policy and the core policy, and some of the states like you've described in the Chesapeake Bay region, the door has been open and the scope has been widened so much that we as scientists have to adapt to it, and make, use our knowledge and use our experience to, promote mitigation projects that really get us back to the original term, no wetland loss. And I think, we're kind of forced into a corner with that, and we have to be clever, we have to be intelligent, and, we have to be collaborative to make them work. And I think that's really, one of the take-home messages I get out of, our discussions today, and any more we discuss about this.
Very true. Thanks, Judd. All right. Anybody else?
How long do pardon my voice, how far back do we go? Because in New Jersey, we're down to 1 bay, and offsite mitigation, isn't allowable for general purposes to say that, well, it's been gone for, since the 1930s. So can we mitigate in some other area in hopes that it will come back because it's not sort of an in-kind within the watershed, et cetera? I think that question about that is a bit challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. Very. And we kind of addressed that in Chesapeake Bay when we had lost, well, not in the Chesapeake Bay, in the coastal bays, when the eelgrass had been eradicated for quite a while. And, but the water quality was adequate. And we started adding seeds, eelgrass seeds, and it actually took and has expanded. And so it had gone back quite a while for that. But, it all came down to the fact that the water quality was good enough to support it, and there were just no seeds at that point. Did you had a question too, Paul, in the chat about, I lost it. It's enhancements versus mitigation. What are you getting at for enhancements?
Well, so in some freshwater wetlands or coastal marshes, you could cut down frag to get Spartina. But for SAV, what does that enhancement? Because SAV is often bundled with wetlands in terms of regulatory announcement. So does that mean that if you have a hole in your seagrass bed, you can throw some seeds and that counts for your mitigation because it's enhancement, knowing that the grass will eventually, fill that hole. It's one of the only, wetlands that expands beyond where you've planted it, as you've seen in those bays. So, getting, sort of off the hook for, planting plugs 2 feet outside of an existing expansive bed and then claiming success because you've enhanced it because the plants grew together. But I just want to hear other people's viewpoints about that, of whether that's allowable within their states or whether that's just not considered at all.
Well, I'll start. We probably wouldn't allow that. That's a mitigation plan that probably wouldn't be approved here. But with that said, I have seen plans that have gone towards enhancing diversity in freshwater systems. So not necessarily density, not building a bed from scratch, but if there's just hydrilla in an area, or Elodea or coontail or something, where they've gone in and planted Vallisneria to put in another species, improve some diversity. But yeah, what you're getting at. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that enhancement aspect? Phil, Z, Anne, are your questions different, or are they getting at that?
No, response to Paul's two questions. So first, how far back do we go? The answer to that is 1972, the Clean Water Act being passed. And under other sections of the Clean Water Act, SAV is considered a designated use. And so if it was there in 72, it's protected going forward. And so that's the answer to that question. Then we generally discourage people from quote unquote enhancement. So site selection models that have been developed up here, I think, Forrest stated this very clearly, avoiding existing eelgrass meadows as part of your site selection process is kind of built into the process here in New England.
Thanks, Phil. Z, you have a question or a response?
Yes, I think the 4 presentations were phenomenal because I think it solidified on some of the issues that I was commonly grappling with, is that we lack so much science in some of the areas to move forward with a restoration plan, yet there are damages that are happening that are largely out of the control if it's for the public good, whether it be building a roadway or reinforcing ports and ferry lines and things like that. So it's one of those, the damage is going to happen and it's moving forward. And so what's the next best step when you're planning the mitigation so that you have a high chance of success, but when you lack the background data, it's this uncomfortable position. As a scientist, I want more data before I act, but then there's not the science for me to act. Yet the damage is happening. It, to me, it leads to an uncomfortable situation, and we've got a nice grouping of both academics and those that are interacting it from a management or governmental standpoint. And I think to Anne's point about some of these projects are happening. We may not have a great movement forward, but what are the aspects of mitigation that we can kind of agree upon as far as the best practices moving forward. So at least we can try something as these environments are being destroyed, whether we like it or not. In some cases, from the political side, it's just not. It's out of the control. And then the other point too is the whole idea of these test plots. And I think we talked about that at the group meeting, the Chesapeake Bay meeting, about what size is a test plot and how it's so commonly used as like just a meter squared or a couple meters squared, which is not adequate. That's not what a seagrass bed operates at. And so a lot of these models about where best to do our test plots, and then we put a meter squared out, I feel like we're kind of setting ourselves up for failure since that's not ecologically significant. And so I would argue that the idea is to gather the data points that you have and mobilize the resources that are available and just start trying some of these things at larger scale when you do have those funding pools that are made available to you from these mitigation charges, because the smaller scale operations aren't going to protect some of these projects like Phil you're talking about with acreages. I mean, those are substantial damages to the ecosystem. And me doing a couple meter squared or a few meter squared plots, I just feel like that's not really leading me in the science towards the best strategy. So I guess it's a combination of comments and queries and challenges on all of the above.
Great.
That's
Thanks,
my stress slide.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. We get a lot of pushback on requiring SAV mitigation when we can't prove that it's going to work. And generally, my response is, we restore all sorts of habitats and they don't all work. Like there's no 100% like guarantee that if you put out oyster spat, you're going to get an oyster bar. There's no guarantee that if you plant 10,000 trees, they're all going to live. And so we've got to do, I just keep saying, we've got to do what we can, where we can. Obviously, if the water quality sucks, don't bother. But, if it's good enough, generally, the seeds, some of them are going to take. And so we got to just keep moving towards it. And, we've done a lot of the research here with regard to, particularly with, our freshwater and mesohaline species. That's mainly what we're working on. We're not using as much eelgrass for mitigation, and particularly not in Maryland. But we've seen some pretty good success with our freshwater species. And we can't guarantee it, and nobody likes being told to do a $100,000 or $500,000 project that they can't guarantee. But my response is always like, okay, well then don't impact the SAV, like don't do it. And so we have to, I think, like you're saying, we have to try, we have to, move the needle forward the best we can. Anne, your hand is up.
I was just gonna respond to the question about enhancement, and yes, there have been some projects that did enhancement in terms of increasing the density of the seagrass. So that was done for the Oregon inlet mitigation. So DOT was required to do it, and the project, I mean, they just didn't. There's not a really good way to do restoration right now in North Carolina because there's not that. Right now, people aren't really collecting seeds to plant because the concept is it's the water quality, or they would be there, right? Or the wave edge. So anyhow, they put out these breakwaters called Reef Maker to break the wind energy in an area where there was patchy SAV. But this is in a large sound. And after I think it was 5 years of monitoring, they concluded it had reached enough increase in density that it was successful. So I think we're going to see more of that kind of thing. But it's a big structure, is out there in the middle of the sound, and yeah, but it seemed to work in that case.
All right. Well, great. Thank you. Good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. All right, Tay, your hand is up.
Hey everyone, and thanks for all the good talks. I have a lot of thoughts swirling around in my head about this, and I really appreciated, Brooke, what you just said, and Z and Ann too, all the comments. And I guess to Z's point, the idea of just going out there and planting as much as you can, I see that, and maybe with the seeding program, that's the way to go. But I'm I'm curious what people think about forest talk and why our site selection model was so, just it was a very basic. We thought we were adding data to it. We had light, we were targeting, kind of coarse sediment data, and we could only collect light data at specific sites. But then all of our test plots failed, and they were not just a meter squared, they were kind of like medium size plots. So, like along a transect, I can't remember the area, Forrest might remember, but and they all failed. So discouraging. But maybe you just don't give up. Maybe it was, it was just that one season. Maybe that was a poor season. And so having more of a chronic, that's not the right word, but like always going out there and seeding some kind of a program like that, maybe that's what we need to invest in. Yeah, just curious what people think of that. And then just my comment about the augmentation of a meadow. I agree with what Phil is saying. We don't really approve that kind of thing, but there's there's potentially a case, I think, for um, boosting a meadow along if the conditions are good, if the water quality is good, sediment's good, but it's for some reason not taking off. Maybe the circulation's not providing seeding to that area. And we had the experience in Boston Harbor where there was some grass nearby, and then we planted a restoration site, and suddenly it blended together, it took off, and it was 80 acres like next season. It was amazing. So it was just timing, I think, in that case, because it took off when things naturally, like everything was improving and the natural meadow was improving. But I think that our restoration certainly helped that. So I don't know, just
Awesome. Yeah, that's a nice good news story to hear about. Okay, thanks, Tay. So we have about 7 minutes until we're supposed to go into our next little sub-segment of the meeting, which is partner updates. And I want to reserve that 7 minutes to discuss what you all would like the deliverable to be for this quarter. Admittedly, we are still a little behind on some of our other deliverables, so we need to deal with those too. But for this one, what would you like to see? We were tossing around some ideas last week, and because I've already done half of it, I was kind of pushing towards a guidance document on what we would recommend for SAV mitigation requirements, and SAV mitigation and monitoring requirements. Is something like that something you all would like to see? Obviously ours is kind of Chesapeake Bay specific, or will be once I finish it, but do you want something like that for a generalized East Coast? Do you have other ideas on what you would like to see come out of this? Is just a meeting report and summary of discussion adequate? What are your thoughts on that? Anybody? Paul's voice is gone, so he's writing. Oh, that wasn't for this, but he's got comments in the chat. So not about this question though. Judd, what have you got?
Well, I think it would be interesting to read your document. I mean, the level that you went to get to what you're producing there is quite thorough and extensive. Perhaps it could be used as a model. It almost seems like we have to think of this on maybe a state by state or regional basis, largely because, like here, we have this multi-species system. Chesapeake Bay the same way, only they get into the low salinity component, which can get pretty complex. So it almost seems like we need a part two of this to actually flush out, ideas about, what a guidance document might look like. And that's my suggestion.
Okay, thank you. Would you mean, dedicate another meeting to just further discussion? Is that what you're thinking? Or are you thinking maybe just follow up online? Do you have any?
I would say reading your document, thinking about what was said today, and then maybe reconvening,
Okay.
a portion of the meeting to, make a path forward.
Okay, that's fair. Okay, so my plan then will be once I finish it up and circulate it through my crew here, and we send it out, I'll send it to you all as well. I'll put it on the website with our other resources and put it in an email, and then we can reconvene and rediscuss. Megan, what you got?
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but I wanted to just say here, I think we've talked a lot today about avoidance, minimization, and then getting to mitigation. But from my seat in the regulatory process, it really feels like when we get projects that come in, the avoidance is just like, yeah, we did try to avoid. Here's how we're going to try to minimize. And then this is why we need to mitigate because we can't move it anywhere else. So it would be really helpful if out of this, and maybe it's paired with Maryland, the effort we're doing with Maryland, if there's a really clear connection to scientific literature or something, or just the general consensus of this field, like when you there's really no other option but to avoid. And just be like, well, then really should not be doing this project here, even if it is water dependent or what have you. Because it gets skipped over even, and there's lots of stuff you can put in your application to say that you did your due diligence. Yeah. But also, I mean, for states that have general permits, those don't require mitigation. And then you get into a situation where you have, death by 1,000 cuts, where you have all these small little projects that in a tributary or a certain, portion of the watershed, just the numbers just start to add up. And it's like, well, now what? So it'd be helpful if it's something like, large beds, they just need to be avoided. Or like, are we giving up on sparse beds once you hit a certain threshold? Does it matter? Does it need to be paired with a species? Does it need to, like, I think you mentioned for the Maryland example, we're kind of tying it to water quality improvement. So are you trending upwards in maybe your SAV numbers in that area or down? Like tying that in would be helpful for regulators that this, I'm talking not just about the state, but the Corps as well, but then also EPA and NOAA. Not everybody has an SAV background. And so they're just like, well, and particularly for the Corps, they're just looking at like 404 process, just one little piece. They have to do all this other stuff. So I think it would be helpful if we could provide a little bit more on why avoidance, particularly in maybe, many cases, is kind of the only way you're going to get meaningfully to that no net loss, because most of the efforts seemingly are not successful to restore, at least within that 5 years. We're talking like 50, 60 years. It's like, well, okay. So that's my 38 minutes.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that very much. It does seem like it's very easy to get around the avoid. And, I've been guilty of, supporting projects that impact SAV for the greater benefit, but I totally, it would be nice to take the avoidance much more seriously than it's taken, and say like, and that gets into the whole like, how necessary is it to like protect your shoreline? Should we be letting everybody protect shorelines? And is erosion really happening? And we've had this conversation in Chesapeake Bay, like, is it a perceived loss? Are you seeing your neighbors protect their shoreline, so you think you should too, when nothing's actually happening? You're not actually losing acres, things like that.
Have you done anything to your shoreline in the uplands to protect, or are you just going to the shore?
Yeah, exactly. So I appreciate that.
There's a good suggestion in the chat, Brooke, from Anne.
Anne,
I don't know if
could
you
you include in your recommendation document what is currently being done by different states, such as seeding versus transplantation and loop? Yeah.
So we talked as a group about trying to do a similar to the regulatory database that we have, is to create one more specific to, I guess, more the in lieu fee practices, regulatory processes, if states have them. So kind of an expansion on the table that you already had started with your report.
might be a
Yeah.
separate report, but you know, it's relevant to how you handle litigation.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, cool. Thank you. Bill?
Yeah, this is following up. I thought I don't want to lose Megan's point, which I think is an excellent one. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it calls for maybe another guidance document on the science behind some of the impacts. So I know there's papers on fragmentation and impacts of blue crabs. I know there are papers on crop scars, and maybe a compilation of that type of literature would be helpful for people who are trying to make the case that avoidance is required. Because the first hurdle is, what is the impact? Then we argue, you have to mitigate, and I would argue that every mitigation requirement should have a contingency plan, and we try to make it as costly as possible to the applicant to discourage the impact. And I say that only half facetiously. But that first step, I think it would be very helpful for people to have a document with a lot of the, common activities that we all deal with, and having literature that would speak to the impacts of those activities.
Okay, excellent suggestion. All right. Well, with that, I am going to move us on to the last part of our meeting, which is always one of my favorite parts of our quarterly get-togethers, and that is partner updates. So we've got 17 minutes left, and during this time, anybody that has any exciting news, not exciting news, news at all, anything that you want to report out, what you're doing, what's going on in your state and your region, now's your chance. And this is a great opportunity for you new folks that haven't joined us before to maybe get in a little detail about what you're doing more than what you did in your earlier introduction. So Z has her hand up first. So Z, I'll go to you. You there?
So, yes, sorry.
Oh, there you
So this is
go.
perfectly timed, this conversation. So Project Seagrass has the Seagrass Spotter website, which is where anyone can go and upload photos and whatnot. And we're about to launch the Seagrass Restorer, which will be an additional site where anyone can go on and just put a pin where they're doing a restoration project. And so it'll be up to you about how much information you want to include. We're going to be asking for some minimal information, not your data set or anything along those lines. But this would be a good place for you to put, if it's, even if you wanted to, if it's a win, if it's a lose, if it's an unknown, if it's a planned site. And so the idea is that it can be populated so you can see who's doing restoration, particularly in your region, but you can also refer it out to any of the stakeholders that might be doing projects in the area. I think Phil mentioned one of the projects where then they came through and they built something over the restored bed. So it would be a map then that would have globally any of the restoration activities on that. So it's in beta testing now with the UK folks for us here. But we really do want to push it out and get widespread use across the world.
That's exciting. We're trying to do that here, but not officially like in a fancy app. So that's great. Nice. Do you know if Seagrass Spotter, last time I checked in on that, it was not being used for like freshwater plants and freshwater SAV. Is it still there? Is it still just seagrasses, or
It's
can we
still
use it in
seagrass.
Chesapeake Bay yet?
Yeah, I was going to say it's called Seagrass Spotter and then Seagrass
Mm.
Restorer, because
Mm.
there's, I know, I'm working. Maybe
Okay.
when you're here,
Mm.
um, you'll can further push that agenda. But the app itself, you can drop a pin anywhere. It's just you're going to lack some of the options when it comes to the drop down menus, and so I think
Yeah,
that's the biggest limitation. And so starting to expand that a bit, but duly noted, and will be thoroughly pushed forward.
I've talked to Ben about it. Yeah. All right, awesome. Well, thank you for that update. I think next we had Jessica Griffin.
Hi all. So I introduced myself at the beginning, but if you came in later, this is my first time here. I'm a postdoc at Northeastern University with Randall Hughes, and I also work with TNC of Massachusetts. And right now at TNC, we're working on an NRCS funded restoration project where the aim is to restore eelgrass, salt marsh, and oyster reefs in Massachusetts, to do a site selection study to identify 5 sites for each of those habitats. And I'm sort of serving as the seagrass lead. So I'm in the process right now of working with folks to get more background on where we have eelgrass in Massachusetts and where we have the conditions for restoration. We got the funding at the end of last year, and it's a 5-year program. So we're really excited to hopefully be able to share some of the results maybe at future meetings. And I just wanted to make you all aware that we're doing this project, and I got a lot out of this meeting today, hearing about some of the latest of like what has worked and hasn't worked in eelgrass restoration. So thank you all for sharing.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Do you have a website or anything? If the project's if you've got a web page for the project or anything like that, if you want to put it in the chat, that'd be great. If not, no worries.
We do not have a website at this point, but that's a great idea. I will maybe pitch that to my boss, who is Steve Kirk, if anyone knows him at TNC, who's the Coastal Program Manager in Massachusetts.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Next, Megan Fitzgerald. What you got?
Hey, thanks. It's been a while since I presented here, but I wanted to remind folks of this literature review project I've been working on for what seems like many years, but I think it's only been a year officially. So I've wrapped up collecting all of the documents, so actually doing this sort of scraping, and I am very slowly going through sort of the process of eliminating and actually getting down to what I'm actually going to read. And part of what I didn't plan on doing, but did become part of this project, was I conducted many different interviews. Many people that I interviewed are on this call today. And so as I'm going through the pain of reading, I've started sort of updating and sort of putting the interview information that I collected in a sort of readable and shareable document. So that was something I hope I can share with this group, just what it would, scraping people's names and making it, taking any tone out of any notes that I took. But really, I think it's useful just to kind of sum up, as of, the last 8 months or so of where, we are from a sort of regulatory, academic, and sort of consulting or practitioner perspective of shoreline management, and where the concerns are, sort of the needs, and sort of specifically for my project, needs of that project. I might need to leave that out. But I think it would be a useful document. And right now it's too long. No one will read it. So that's what I'm doing right now, trying to summarize it in a way that someone will look at it. But eventually, if you didn't catch my previous presentation, I'm hoping to create a decision support tool that will be useful for regulators. And sort of, I mentioned it earlier, but then Phil, I think, mentioned sort of trying to tie the regulatory conversations and the decisions for allowing this project, not allowing that project. What are the monitoring recommendations? All of that. Tie that to specific examples in the literature, so that people that are making the decisions that don't have this background have actually something to go to be like, okay, this is why, as a core person or a state person, I'm asking for more information or not. So anyway, that's the goal there, and hopefully that will be useful for everyone. So
I think it will be very useful. Thank you, Megan. And when it's ready, we'll be happy to put it on our website too, if you want another home for it or a link to it.
I'm hoping the state it's in is not shareable, but it will be.
No. One day when you're ready. Thank you. All right, Katie Lund.
Hi, everyone. I join occasionally to give updates about the Long Island Sound Eelgrass Collaborative. In the chat, I'm going to put a link for a workshop that we're having in the end of May And like the East Coast SAV group, we have quarterly meetings. Most of them are virtual. We have 3 virtual a year, but we do try and have one in-person workshop. And this one in May is going to have restoration focus. So I definitely wanted to mention that as kind of a follow-up to your topic here today. We're going to have some speakers both give presentations and provide panel discussion on both the National Park Service and EPA restoration projects. So we have Stephanie Camel and Brad Peterson regarding the National Park Service project, and Susie Avazian and Phil Colarusso about the EPA project happening in Rhode Island. And then we also have a focus in the afternoon on seed-based restoration because the University of Connecticut and Jamie Vaudry through our reserve and Steve Schott through the Cornell Cooperative Extension have just been awarded a grant to do seed-based restoration in Long Island Sound. So we're going to have a significant portion of the afternoon focused on that topic, along with a tour of our Avery Point Rankin Lab, where we're hoping to do some renovations for different types of restoration needed work, seed-based restoration needed work. And so we can do some upgrades to that Rankin Lab facility, and we're gonna just provide a tour, hopefully get some really good input from participants that are attending the workshop for some of that renovation that's going to be happening over the course of the next 3 years. So just wanted to give that update. And in that link that I put in the chat, you can register and see a draft agenda that we're going to continue fleshing out here in the next month. The workshop is in person, like our workshop last year in June, it was in person. We're hoping to also have at least a virtual option, you know, for people that can't travel to hear the initial presentations, but because a lot of it's going to be breakout and doing this tour and a poster session, those obviously won't be able to be kind of streamed. But the presentations at the beginning, we're hoping to have a virtual option set up here in the next month. So please do register, even if you're interested in that part.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. That's very exciting. And congrats to Jamie on her funding. That's cool.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Okay, Erica Kuntz.
Hello. I do apologize. I cannot get my camera to work for some reason. But anyway, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Erica Kuntz. I actually just started earlier this month working with Brooke and Caitlin at Maryland DNR. So I'm new to the team here and new to these meetings. Coming from the University of Maryland Horn Point Laboratory, where I've been working on finishing my master's on living shorelines and interactions with SAV beds in the Chesapeake Bay. So some of this is some of the folks in this call I've spoken with and recognize many names. So I look forward to learning more about the SAV world, and as I continue my professional trajectory, moving more into the subtitle zone, because what I did before was marsh work. So just keep going, more subtitle. Anyway, thanks.
Great. Thanks, Erica. And welcome. I appreciate you jumping on here and doing the intro since you missed it in the beginning. So all good. All right, one more. We've got Devin.
Hi, just reiterating that I'm new. I work in Maine. I'm the coastal resiliency specialist for the Maine Coastal Program. I used to work down in North Carolina with Brian Silliman doing seagrass restoration. So really trying to bring that vibe here to the state. There's already a lot of good work happening. I co-lead the Maine Seagrass Consortium, and we are releasing a state plan for a seagrass action plan is what we're calling it. So once that's finalized, we'll share it with this group. It's a labor of love from a lot of different stakeholders in academia and practitioners and government. So it's a pretty cool coming together. And like I mentioned, we'll be applying for some in lieu funds to do some more restoration projects in the state. Right now, most of our work is concentrated in the Casco Bay region. So we're trying to expand that out.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you. And thanks for joining our crew. I like it. Okay, anybody else? Anybody else? Anybody else? All right, well then, with that, I will say that our next meeting is going to be in July. I don't think we have set a date for it yet. Z
No.
put some information on it in the chat, but as soon as we set the date, we will get it out there. We'll have a steering committee meeting before that meeting. And so anybody that's on the steering committee, heads up that we'll be scheduling that as well. And that next meeting will be on ecosystem service trade-off evaluation. A very fun and complicated topic. Seems like everything about SAV is complicated, but the evaluation, service evaluation trade-off is something we talk about a lot. And then our meeting after that will be in October, and that one will be on SAV and water quality improvements or impairments. So those are our next two topics. I think probably sometime soon we'll do another poll for topics to come after that. So yeah, I think that's about it. Z, Jesse, have any last minute words?
Just thank everybody for the time. Really appreciate it, and hopefully you found it as helpful and useful as I did. I learned a lot today. So thanks to everybody who presented, and thanks for coming.
Yes,
Yeah.
happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day. Go do something good for the planet, which we all do every day. But thank you all so much for your time. It is always a pleasure.
Thank
All right,
you.
talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.